I want to speak a bit about the downside risks. The IMF report projects a rise in global oil prices of about 30% in 2021. We've already seen increasing rift between India and Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia is trying to cut OPEC production. India, as one of the major buyers, is unhappy with that and cutting back on purchases from Saudi Arabia, saying this is not acceptable. How do you see inflationary pressures on commodity prices, especially on global oil, playing itself out in an Indian context?
Yeah, so the 30% increase in prices this year for oil comes from the massive contraction that happened in 2020 when oil prices completely collapsed. So, our expectation in our forecast is about, I think, around $60 a barrel of oil. There are OPEC cuts that are in place which are supporting these kinds of prices. So again, I think over the medium term, the risks to oil prices are more on the downside, because as we see more supply coming up, as these cuts are removed, there will be more pressure on keeping prices lower. And of course, the world is also transitioning away from fossil fuels towards more kind of green energy. So all of that will keep oil prices low. But yes, in the near term, the risks are there of oil prices going up further as global demand surges, which is what we are seeing. Now, to your question of the implications for inflation, it does affect just the simple headline inflation numbers. The question is whether it affects inflation expectations, which is really quite important for monetary policy making. And then there is where you have to see in some countries inflation expectations just don't move with oil prices, in some others they do. But over time, just anchoring inflation expectations so that it doesn't move with these kinds of commodity prices is very important.
Let's speak about cross-border trade, where you're projecting that global trade will remain subdued but strengthening to about 8.5%, 8.4%. Now, at this moment, international freight and travel haven't fully resumed. So given that, how do you see international trade play itself out, especially from an Indian export and import perspective?
In terms of global trade, actually, if you took at global merchandise trade, that has rebounded. It has recovered, and it's well ahead of the pre-pandemic levels. So just as we've seen around the world manufacturing recovering very strongly, we've seen global trade recover very strongly. So despite all the concerns of breakdowns in global supply chains, I think actually global trade has been quite resilient. What has not recovered is global services trade, and not surprisingly, given that tourism and travel is still well contained. For India, of course, again, one of the biggest exports India is doing right now is in terms of vaccines, and that is terrific. It has exports to over 77 countries, and that is a big part of the solution for this crisis too. So India's playing a very prominent role over there. But indeed, we expect to see global trade pick up. Not just pick up. It's doing really well, and India again coming into more parts of that global supply chain would be very good over time.
The Indian government has rolled out production-linked incentives in several sectors in the hope of drawing FDI into India, and the numbers on the look of it seem to be suggesting that India is attracting more foreign direct investment despite the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic. How do you view the government's schemes? Because this at some level goes against the idea of free global trade, but also incentivizes manufacturing to move to India from countries like China. Is it working? How are you viewing what the government's doing?
I think it's welcome to see the government attracting foreign direct investment. I would say, right now FDI in the world is still recovering. It's not back to pre-pandemic levels, so these are still difficult times. But again, in terms of the big factors of attracting FDI, good infrastructure, the rule of law, good governance, those are very, very important factors in attracting FDI. And so India has had success in attracting FDI, but again, it will have to continue to work on that front. I would just flag one thing in the matter of capital flows and in investment. With the U.S. recovering very strongly, you are seeing interest rates going up, and interest rates in the U.S. are going up, and the expectation is that interest rates will go up even further. That usually poses a risk to some countries in terms of capital flows. And that's again something to pay close watch to.